The end of the international military presence in Afghanistan. US forces have just said that their pullout is over.
I'm here to announce the completion of our withdrawal from Afghanistan and the end of the military mission to evacuate American citizens, third country nationals, and vulnerable Afghans.
The news came after a day in which the last American planes flew out of Kabul carrying civilians, diplomats, and soldiers at the close of a 20-year operation. In Kabul, accusations of civilian casualties caused by the US in these final days after a drone strike aimed at Islamic State militants.
We lost 10 persons, including of my daughter. He was at 2 years old. She was 2 years old.
We'll be live in Kabul and in Washington and ask what comes next for the Afghan people. Also tonight.
Oh my God! Yo!
High winds and life-threatening floods as Hurricane Ida hits Louisiana. And in Tokyo, it's another gold for Lee Pearson, the 14th of his career. Good evening. Within the last hour, it has been announced that the United States has completed its military withdrawal from Afghanistan 20 years after the military engagement in the country began. The head of US Central Command, Kenneth McKenzie, told a news conference a short time ago that it was a monumental accomplishment that 130,000 people had been flown out of the country since the Taliban seized power earlier this month. The development came a short time after the United Nations Security Council adopted a resolution calling on the Taliban to allow safe passage for anyone left in the country who still wants to leave. Well, in a moment, we'll be speaking live to Barbara Plett-Usher, our correspondent in Washington. But first, let's join our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, who is live in Kabul tonight. A significant moment, Lise, at the end of a scramble of the last fortnight.
A scramble of the last fortnight, intensified security measures in the last few days, and in the last hour, the kind of gunfire that I'm sure all of our viewers can hear. It's why I'm wearing a helmet tonight. The skies were full of red tracer fire, machine gun fire, bullets being fired in celebration. America's longest war has finally ended here in Afghanistan, and there will be a long night of celebration by Taliban supporters who will hail not just the departure of the last American soldier from Afghanistan, the last of what they describe as a foreign occupation, but they hail it as the defeat of the mighty American empire. It is nearly 20 years since a US-led invasion toppled the Taliban. And tonight at Kabul International Airport, we saw the images of the last American soldiers face to face with the elite guards of the Taliban transferring control. It must have been an incredibly difficult moment for the Americans. President Joe Biden kept his word, but it will have been at what a cost.
Lise Doucette in Kabul, thank you. Let's turn to Barbara Pletasha, who's our correspondent in Washington, because we heard from the US military a few moments ago, but we are now expecting to hear from the US Secretary of State. And what is the expectation, Barbara, about how he is going to phrase and reflect on what lies ahead now?
Well, I think he's going to be looking forward quite a bit more than reflecting, although we'll see how that goes. The military press conference was very much about what is coming. They said that the Taliban had been helpful and useful for them in terms of the evacuation, but they would have their hands full when it came to Islamic State militants. And crucially, they said that they had not been able to get everybody out that they wanted to get out. So this is, I think, going to be very much the focus of Secretary Blinken's comments, that even though the military mission has ended, the diplomatic mission to evacuate those who want to get out, American citizens, but also Afghans who worked with Americans, will continue. We've heard quite a bit from him already on that, and I expect he will outline more how they will continue to press the Taliban to let people leave freely. That is something that the Taliban has promised. That is something that has been mentioned in a UN Security Council resolution, which has just been passed. The international community uniting around this demand that anyone who wants to leave should leave, be able to leave, and also putting forward a sort of set of ground rules for the coming days, the coming months and years with a new Taliban-led government in Afghanistan, and perhaps Secretary Blinken will refer to that as well.
Barbara Pletasha in Washington, thank you very much. Let's return now to what the day has been like in Kabul, what turned out to be the last day for US troops in Afghanistan. There were rockets that were fired towards Kabul airport earlier today. The Islamic State group claimed responsibility for that. And the United States has been accused of causing significant civilian casualties in a drone strike that was aimed at targeting IS in Kabul, and those civilian casualties including children. Sikandar Kermani, our correspondent, reports on that now.
Flames leaped from a car after militants from the Islamic State group used it to launch rockets at Kabul airport. They were intercepted by a missile defense system. But planes landing today fired flares to try and protect themselves from further attack. Nearby, a family combs through the wreckage of a US drone strike launched yesterday. Relatives and neighbours are collecting remains of the victims to bury. They angrily reject American claims the vehicle targeted was being used by a suicide bomber from the Islamic State group. If there was a bomb inside, the car would have been blown up, says this man. Amongst those killed, 2-year-old Samaya, 12-year-old Farzad, and these two twins, as well as Nasser, who had previously worked alongside American forces. The family was hoping to be evacuated out of the country.
While my brother came from his work, want to park the car in here. And their children, it was in the car. On that time that happening, Okra.
And how many people from your family
10
died?
persons died in here. We lost 10 persons, including of my daughter. He was at 2 years old.
What happened here appears to be an awful human tragedy. It also underlines the challenges the US is going to face in trying to target militants from afar, and the terrible consequences ordinary Afghans have to pay. The US has said it's assessing and investigating reports of civilian casualties, but insists an imminent threat to the airport was disrupted.
Nobody wants to see innocent life taken. We take it very, very seriously. And when we know that we have caused innocent life to be lost in the conduct of our operations, we're transparent about it. We're investigating this. I'm not going to get ahead of it.
The evacuation effort is now complete, with US soldiers flown out ahead of Tuesday's withdrawal deadline. Many Afghans remain desperate to leave the country. At this bus stand in Kabul, many are headed for the Iranian border. Nearly all are hoping to be smuggled across. Passenger numbers have more than doubled in recent weeks. The previous government only cared about getting rich themselves, says this man. Now the Taliban are here. There are no jobs. There's no work anywhere. I need to be able to feed my kids. Everything has become more expensive. We can't live here anymore. A new era in Afghanistan is about to begin. The Taliban say they're bringing peace and ending corruption. But for those here, the deep uncertainty that has accompanied their arrival is a final push towards a new life. Sikander Kamani, BBC News, Kabul.
Well, it is now just over a fortnight since the Taliban reached Kabul and took control of almost all of Afghanistan. They've portrayed themselves as more moderate than when they ruled in the 1990s and promised an amnesty to those who worked for foreign forces or the Afghan army. But there is growing evidence of a different reality on the ground, including revenge killings. Yogita Limai reports.
A sight that strikes fear in the hearts of millions of Afghans. The Taliban back on the streets, back in control. The group assured amnesty for everyone. The announcement was made from the office of a former government spokesman they'd killed a few weeks ago. His death was justified as a punishment for his deeds. Even since the pledge of pardon, others have been killed. Haji Mullah Achakzai was the security director of Badghis province. Multiple sources have told the BBC he was executed by the Taliban just over a week ago. As was Ghulam Sakhi Akbari, security head for Farah province. We spoke to a soldier from the Afghan Special Forces who's in hiding. He didn't want to be named.
تخطی کردن در ولایت قندهار 12 نفر چند روز پیش در ولایت جلال که دوستای ما حضور شخصی دوستایی بودن که باشان ارتباط داشتیم میشناختیم همراه ما در اسپیشال فورس بودن چون اونا کشته شدن ترور شدن با بهانه‌هایی که کشیدن از خانه‌هایشان اونا را از بین بردن.
Other soldiers have also told us about colleagues being killed. And a high-ranking police official in hiding wanted his story to be heard.
Yesterday, Taliban searching my colleagues, my assistants, and investigated him for 5 hours. Asked, where is your chief? It's problem. The Taliban, they don't have a judicial system. They don't have court. They're killing. It's a very bad situation for me. Now my children is with me. Every day I have to change my location. I'm going now village to village by my food, with my children, with my wife. Sorry. I don't have any money to pass the border.
War? Many like Zarifa Ghaffari, Afghanistan's first female mayor, have fled after threats from the Taliban. She says her father was killed by the group last year and now they're looking for her.
They beat my 2 guards and they took their weapons away of them and all these. And then they were searching for me. Taliban were searching for me, especially those Taliban who came from Wardak province.
Forced to leave her country, Zarifa is now in Germany.
And Taliban did this to me. I did nothing to them. I was not part of their war, man. But they destroyed my everything. And more importantly, they made me to leave the country, which was more important than my mom to me always.
Zala Zazai was a policewoman, one of thousands trained since 2001 by the international community. Out of Afghanistan now, she fears for her colleagues back home.
از همو شماره ها برشان زنگ میه از دفاتر خودشان و حتی بعضا میگن زنگ بیشتر میه حتی نصف شب اونا گفتن که ما شما رو به خاطر کار میخوایم یعنی شما جای سکونتتان برای ما بگوین شما کجا زندگی میکنید این که ما فعلا میتونم حداقل صدای یک زن پلیس افغان باشم میخوایم این موضوعات رو بگویم که خانه ها تلاشی میشه خانمای پلیس را اجازه نمیدن به هیچ صورت.
Acts of reprisal continue with impunity. It could be the result of a gap in the thinking of Taliban leaders and their foot soldiers. But it's mounting evidence that their present is as ruthless as their past. Yogda Lemay, BBC News.
Well, at the UN today, members of the Security Council called on the Taliban to make sure that those who still want to leave the country can do so. But this moment is full of uncertainty for millions of Afghans. Let's return now to Lise Doucette in Kabul. And you've known the country, Lise, for so many years. What is your assessment of what the era that begins tonight looks like for Afghanistan?
Well, since it is a night of history, since it is a time yet again where Afghans are turning the page, if I may, I will bring in a bit of history. I was reporting from Kabul in 1989 when the Soviet troops left, in 92 when the Mujahideen took power, in 2001 when a US-led invasion toppled the Taliban. Afghans have never lived through such a transition, which is so fraught with fear, which is so shrouded in darkness and uncertainty. The mantra of the United States during this withdrawal, which began months ago, was that it would be a safe, orderly and responsible withdrawal. And yet it is one which has ended not just in chaos and violence, but in pain and hurt for Afghans yet again. Afghans who had dared to hope that after the world came knocking on their door in 2001, that when they left it would be the best of days, except it is for so many Afghans the worst of days. The last US soldier has left, promising to come back and get those that they have left behind. And they are counted in, we can't count how many. All we see and hear are the pleading messages for help. But tomorrow morning, nearly 38 million Afghans will wake up and they will wonder, what will life be like under Taliban rule? There will be rules, there will be regulations, but will they be the kind of order that allows Afghans to think this is a country they can still call their own?
Lise Doucette live from Kabul, thank you. And there is more coverage and more analysis of this on the BBC News website. Let's turn to other news now, and there is a warning of life-threatening flooding in the southern United States as Hurricane Ida moves from Louisiana into Mississippi. The storm brought winds of 150 miles an hour as it made landfall, ripping roofs off buildings. One man was killed when a falling tree hit his house. Flash floods have already affected residents of New Orleans, despite defences being strengthened after Hurricane Katrina 16 years ago. Our correspondent Neda Tawfiq is live now in New Orleans. Neda.
Well, rescue efforts are now underway. Resources are pouring in to help with that and to restore infrastructure from the federal government to volunteer organizations. Most pressing, of course, is the hundreds of crews in boats and helicopters trying to reach those still trapped in the floods. The governor has warned that as those efforts continue, the death toll, currently at 1, could rise.
This was the force of Ida's winds as it mercilessly pounded Louisiana with water. A hospital building filled with patients in the town of Cutoff was no match for the storm's fury. Part of the roof was lifted off with ease by the gusts. Low-lying areas were overwhelmed by the tidal surge. This footage from a fire station in Delacroix, Louisiana, captured the dramatic rush of water as the night wore on. In New Orleans, the entire city went dark as the storm raged outside and a transmission tower toppled into the Mississippi River. At this hotel, workers struggled to get their generator running. All across southern Louisiana, the painful task of surveying the damage from Hurricane Ida is underway. The destruction is immense and the situation for some is desperate. In Jefferson Parish, emergency services have received at least 200 rescue calls since last night. There, the rising waters and intense winds left communities in tatters. Clarence has lived here for 50 years and says this is the worst storm he's lived through.
It's terrifying. I mean, we're in the bedroom and it started leaking, and then we come out the bedroom and go into another room and start leaking in that room. And then finally we came into the living room and the dining room here. And this was the only room where it didn't really leak. It leaked, but it didn't leak that bad where the sheetrock fell in.
Without proper shelter, power, or water, he has no choice but to leave. His dilemma now, where to go.
Hurricane Ida strengthened so rapidly that it gave people here very little time to prepare or evacuate. For those who stayed, the night was scary, but seeing the fallout the morning after has been even harder.
Along the roadways, closed and impassable in many areas, we found this family walking to find food. The storm's strong winds ripped their trailer apart in the middle of the night. They took shelter at a neighbor's house.
I ain't got nothing left. House is gone, car is gone. Sorry.
Crews are now focused on rescue operations. The next step, recovery, will be long and difficult. Neda Tawfiq, BBC News, New Orleans.
Now to the latest coronavirus figures here in the UK, which show that there were 26,476 new infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period, which means an average of more than 33,500 per day in the last week. Another 48 deaths have been recorded, and that takes the average number of deaths per day in the last week to 115. On vaccinations, more than 88% of adults have now had their first jab, and 78.6% have had both doses. Within those figures, the latest Scottish data shows another 3,893 cases. Infections have almost doubled every week since restrictions eased. The First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, had been self-isolating after being identified as a close contact of a case. Her PCR test has now come back as negative, which means, under the rules for those who are double vaccinated, she no longer has to isolate. As the Paralympics enter a second week of competition, the COVID situation in Tokyo is continuing to worsen. There are now more than 10,000 people seriously ill, waiting for hospital beds. Hospitals say they can't deal with the growing numbers of serious cases, let alone if there was an outbreak in the Paralympic village. As it stands, around 44% of Japan's population is fully vaccinated. Our Tokyo correspondent, Rupert Wingfield-Hayes, has been travelling with a medical team in southern Tokyo.
In the back of the car, Dr. Kazuma Tashiro is trying to find a hospital bed for one of his COVID patients. In this densely packed part of southern Tokyo, there are now dozens of COVID patients who need to be in hospital but can't get a bed. Dr. Tashiro and his team are a literal lifeline. In this block, a 61-year-old man is very sick and on oxygen.
So the last night, I called him to check if he was alive, and he could talk with me at that time. But this morning, I couldn't talk with him by phone. So I'm very anxious for his healthy conditions.
As soon as he enters, it's apparent the man is alive. It turns out he hasn't been able to pay his phone bill, so it's been cut off. He's also removed his oxygen mask, and as he checks, he finds his blood oxygen level is very low.
His saturated SpO2, the blood oxygen level, is only 92%. It is not good value, so I put the oxygen mask to his mouth. And please keep it to protect your life.
It's the arrival of the Delta variant here in Japan that has led to this explosion of COVID cases. If you look back to mid-July, there were around 1,500 new cases a day. By mid-August, that had jumped to 6,000. And now we're seeing the same with seriously ill. At the end of July, Dr. Tashiro and his team were treating just one seriously ill person. Last week, that had jumped to 50. Back at base, staff are constantly working the phones, trying to find beds. So what if there's a COVID outbreak at the Paralympics?
Yeah, I think there are no room to treat the Paralympic members, because many Japanese people cannot get into the hospitals.
It's time to move again. A new address and a new set of PPE. Like the first man, this patient has not been vaccinated. This is the pattern now. The man is in bad condition. His lips are turning blue and he's having difficulty breathing. Dr. Tashiro thinks he may have pneumonia. He really needs to be in hospital.
It is very difficult for us to make a definite diagnosis.
So he needs to go to hospital now?
Yes.
And
definitely.
What did they say? Is there any beds or you don't know
yes,
yet?
Yes. No bed.
Dr. Tashiro and his team are keeping these people alive. But across Tokyo, there are now more than 10,000 COVID patients waiting for a hospital bed. Each extra day they are forced to wait, the more likely it is they will die. Rupert Wingfield-Hayes, BBC News, in Tokyo.
In the latest Paralympic action, Johnny Peacock won a bronze medal in his 100-metre sprint final, having been the champion for the last 2 games. And there have been 3 more golds for Great Britain, for wheelchair racer Andrew Small, archer Phoebe Patterson-Pine, and for Sally Pearson in dressage. He is the 3rd most successful British Paralympian ever. From Tokyo, here's Andy Swiss.
He couldn't do it again, could he? Johnny Peacock chasing a Paralympic hat-trick. Peacock has struggled with injury since the last games, but he roared out of the blocks. The rest were closing in, though, and the result was one of the most thrilling races in Paralympic history.
Felix Streng, I think.
Gold for Germany's Felix Streng, but just look how tight it was. The first 4 within 0.03 of a second. Had Peacock got a medal? Well, a photo couldn't separate him and Johannes Floors, so the pair shared the bronze. Peacock later said he probably should have won it, but in defeat, he contributed to a dazzling spectacle. Well, what a dramatic night we've had here in Tokyo. But while Johnny Peacock's reign might be over, earlier on, Britain found a new 100-metre star. Andrew Small took up athletics after watching the London Paralympics. Now the man inspired by 2012 was victorious in 2021.
Small gets it.
For Small, who had to train in his garage during lockdown, the pride was plain. But it was nothing to that back at his family home. His dad, Steve, pushing every inch of the way. And come the finish, this is what it meant.
Yeah, my family are my biggest supporters. They're through thick and thin. They see a lot of behind the scenes ups and downs. There was a lot of long, hard sessions in a cold, dark garage at night. But, you know, the culmination of that is here.
And other British athletes had gold in their sights. In the archery, Phoebe Patterson-Pine taking the title by a single point, the tiniest possible margin for the biggest possible prize. But most remarkably of all, there was another gold for Sally Pearson on Breezer, the horse he'd bred at his home in Staffordshire. His 3rd title here and his 14th in total. Another glittering games for one of British sport's most glittering stars. Andy Swiss, BBC News, Tokyo.
Tennis, and Andy Murray is in action tonight against Greece's Stefanos Tsitsipas at the US Open at Flushing Meadows. Our sports correspondent Nesta McGregor has been watching.
Back in 2012, this was where Andy Murray picked up his first Grand Slam title. A lot's changed since then. For example, he has a new hip. Now 34, he'd need a vintage performance. So, could he turn back the clock?
Oh yes, come on!
A blistering start was also helped by errors from 3rd seed Stefanos Tsitsipas. Father Time may be tapping Andy Murray on the shoulder, but early on, the Brit never looked back, taking the first set 6-2. The 23-year-old Greek knew he needed to raise his levels. Serving like that will work. However, Murray would roar back to force a tiebreak. A closely fought second set, which Tsitsipas won.
No way! Murray's down and Tsitsipas wins the point.
Murray would need to pick himself up for the 3rd. The Brit clearly felt it was a missed opportunity. Murray's fate is yet to be decided, but the same can't be said for Heather Watson, who lost in straight sets. While there was more bad news, British number 1 Johanna Konta withdrew from the tournament through injury. Also in action in New York, British number 1 Dan Evans. He's through to the 2nd round after a 3-1 victory over Brazilian Thiago Monteiro. Nesta McGregor, BBC News.
That's it from us for tonight. Now on BBC One, time for the news wherever you are. Good night.